Jess, let's carry on. What a great session. If you can go on to your third limiting factor, that would be great.
Something that I want to talk about today is trace element deficiencies. This is an issue which it's not new. It's really well researched. There's a lot of information out there. But probably what I'm finding as a private practitioner down here is that there's pretty poor extension and how that research relates to practices that are done on farm. So we'll just have a bit of a chat about copper. So there's two forms. There's a primary copper deficiency and a secondary copper deficiency. So basically the difference between the two is with primary, you just simply don't have enough copper in the diet. And that's really uncommon these days because of widespread use of supplementation programs, the main one being copper in fertiliser. So that's done a really good job of supplying enough copper. Syndrome, which is called a secondary deficiency, and that's where you've got enough copper there, but it's unavailable to the animal. It's either being bound up, or they can't absorb it, or they can't utilise it. And there's a number of reasons why that happens. Down here, I've identified probably molybdenum, high molybdenum levels as being the most common culprit. So if you have a copper to moly ratio of more than 4:1, generally you don't have issues. But if that ratio is a bit skewed because of high moly levels, then it doesn't really matter how much copper you add in. That moly is just making that copper unavailable to the animal. But then there's also some other factors that play a role there as well. And this was brought up during Kim's talk. So high sulfur levels, and often that goes hand in hand with a high moly, but also other minerals as well. Zinc, manganese, and cadmium can cause troubles as well. And another thing that can exaggerate the situation is lime application. So you can see there's a graph that I popped up here on the right hand side, and that's just showing as you increase your pH, then your copper is becoming even less available, and moly particular and sulfur become more available. So you've got a sort of a double whammy there. The copper is less available, and then its antagonists are becoming more available. So that's certainly the most common scenario that I'm seeing down here. And it can have some pretty significant economic effects. Depending on the degree of severity will depend on how much an effect it's having. So it can be anywhere from just poor growth, well I shouldn't say just, can have anywhere from poor growth rates and poor feed conversion through to stock that are actually dying. So if they're getting to the point that cattle are actually dying, most people will identify that as being an issue and then can address it and do something about it. But it's quite an insidious problem because when it's really subtle, when it's just got an effect on your growth rate, unless you're weighing regularly, lessers have got the cattle in the yards all the time, monitoring what they're doing. Kent's got this OptiWeigh system put in his paddock. They're keeping a really close eye on how their cattle are performing. So they're likely to pick these sort of issues up early. But if you're only weighing your cattle every couple of months, your young stock, you may be missing out on these effects on your growth rates. But then there's also some other problems that we see too. So lower fertility. So you've got less calves on the ground. It's pretty easy to do the maths on that. Even if you've only got a couple of % effect on your conception rate, that can be a couple of $1,000 worth of calves that you've missed out on. And then there's also other costs associated with culling for secondary problems. So empty cows or cows that go lame because of problems with joints. So what does it look like? Hopefully Esther can chuck together a poll for this one as well. So I've got 3 animals on the screen, A, B and C. Oh, look at her, she's brilliant, she got it done. So which ones, just glancing at them, do you guys think are deficient? And I'll come back and have a chat about these in a minute. But basically the signs are hugely varied, from no signs, no obvious signs, through to the extreme, which is death in the paddock, and anywhere in between. So probably the most commonly known sign would be a poor hair coat. So this little animal C, you can see that she's got quite a red coat. That's actually an Angus calf. Actually, all these animals here are purebred Angus. And her coat's really quite red, and it's long. So this was taken in the spring. So she should have dropped her winter coat, and she hasn't. And then you can have chronic scouring. So you can see on her rump there that she's lost a fair bit of hair, and that's a sign that she's been scouring for a while, and it's scalded the hair off the back. That's usually something which is only seen with your secondary copper deficiency because of your high moly or your high sulfur, or both. And then we have just a reduced feed conversion. So you have cattle which just aren't performing regardless of the fact that you've got them on a brilliant pasture. And you can see in the background on the bottom two pictures that there's a fair bit of feed there. That little calf in C, she's on a brilliant ryegrass clover pasture, but just going nowhere with it. And that's just through really poor conversion. Then you can see lameness issues, usually in your young growing stock, and that can be anywhere from just a mild limp through to full bone fractures. So you can bring the cattle into the yards, whether it's for marking or weaning or some other husbandry procedure, and then you have cattle breaking legs for no apparent reason, and that's just simply to do with the effects that copper has on bone development. And then we can see reduced fertility, and that's both in your cows and your bulls. Most people will pick up the problem in the cows relatively easy, simply through your poor conception rate, but bulls are probably overlooked. If we have a look at morphology samples from bulls that have got deficiencies, then we can certainly see a repeat problem there with the semen that they're producing. Not saying how much they're producing, but just whether or not what it is that they're making is actually live and normal in shape and able to generate a conception.
So Jess, the poll is actually working now. So would you like me to report back what everyone reckons? 5 people thought C, 6 people thought all of them, 1 person thought none of them, and 1 person thought B.
It looks like my trick has worked again. But yeah, look, they're actually all deficient. And this is just highlighting the fact that sometimes the clinical signs are not there to be seen with the naked eye. But each 3 of these animals I actually sampled individually and got what their copper levels were. And they were all low, varying degrees. So the calf down in C, she was pretty much rock bottom, didn't have much there at all. So hence she's the most severely affected. The bull was only just at the start of a deficiency, hence why he doesn't really look like there's much wrong with him. And then this cow in B, she's sort of halfway between the two. She's starting to show a few signs. They're consistent with the issue. So from the animal samples, there's 2 samples that we can take. There's blood samples and there's liver biopsies, which can be done on live animals as well as post-mortem. So if we're just screening for the disease, we'll take blood samples. If we're trying to work up an actual deficiency, then we might need to do a combination of bloods and livers, depending. And then once we've diagnosed the deficiency, then we can start looking further as to whether it's primary or secondary and what's causing that trouble. So when we start looking at that, that's maybe when we'll start looking at feed samples and soil samples. The reason why I've put a cross over this soil down the bottom here is because soil sample trace element testing on its own has got 0 correlation with animal tissue samples. And so you can't test your soils and say, right, my soils are good, therefore my cows will be good. There's no correlation there at all. And that's probably something that I've had to try to explain to people before, where they might be testing their soils regularly every year for their fertilizer program. But that doesn't correlate to, just because you've got enough copper in your soil doesn't mean that you're going to have enough copper in your cattle. And that's true as well to some degree with your feed samples, but we probably get a bit more information out of feed samples than we do with soil. But the thing that we also need to remember with feed samples is that that you obviously, if down here we're basically mainly predominantly pasture based, and your pasture levels, they vary hugely throughout the year. And also when you're taking those samples, we're making an estimated guess as to what it is that the animals are actually consuming. So if you've got a mixed pasture with a few different pasture varieties, then we need to make a guess that what it is that the cattle are actually consuming. So for example, if you've got 80% ryegrass and 20% clover, the assumption is that they're eating 80% of the ryegrass and 20% of the clover as their daily intake. So that's what you should then collect with your sample. Yeah, so I guess there's a few issues there that can pop up with interpreting that. But the point here is that often that you need to have all four of these bits of information to work out what's going on a farm that's got an issue, and what the underlying cause is, and how you can approach it. And so some people say to me,
I'll just comment there, Jess. Bloods are good in cattle, but in sheep, not reliable. So livers are better. Is that still true?
Yeah. So you caught me, Tim, just as I'm trying to explain the difference between bloods and livers. So hopefully, if I haven't quite addressed it after this, then let me know, and I'll make another comment. But yeah, so quite often people ask me the difference between taking a blood sample and a liver sample. And they're two different things, and you probably have to understand what's happening inside the animal's body to get what it is that you're testing for. Because it doesn't matter what test that you take, you will always get a value of some point, but it's how you interpret that value that you get that's most important. So the way I try to explain it is in cattle, its liver is the main store of copper, and it will try and keep its blood levels of copper relatively constant. The blood delivers the copper to the other tissues in the body where the copper is needed for a variety of different functions. So the liver is aiming to keep that blood levels relatively constant. And so what will happen is, if you think of your liver as being a jug of water and your blood as being a cup, your jug will continually top up your cup to try and keep the cup full at all times. So that's what we've got here. We've got a jug that's full, and therefore our cup is full. Then we go to this other scenario where if we're not getting enough copper into the animal, either because you've got your primary deficiency where there's not enough copper there, or your secondary deficiency where it's there but they can't absorb it or they can't utilize it, then our liver levels start to drop. So in this scenario here, our jug is 50% full, so that means our liver is 50% full. But if we take a blood sample from our cup, it will tell us that our copper levels are full, because the liver is doing what it's supposed to do. It's trying to keep those blood levels topped up as much as it can. So it's not until in this scenario where our jug is empty that suddenly we've got nothing to keep our cup topped up. And this is a scenario where if we took a blood sample, we would go, okay, our cup is empty. So we know if our cup is empty, then our liver stores must be empty as well. As opposed to this scenario here, whereas if we just took blood samples, we would go, our blood levels are normal, but it's not telling us how much is in the liver. So the liver is either full like this one, or it's on its way to becoming empty. So these are Angus calves. And so I received this call, and at the start of the conversation, it was, could I come out and have a look at a calf that was scouring? So this farm has history of yellow scours, typically in younger calves and earlier in the year. So usually in the autumn, in sort of autumn to winter with 1 month old calves. But these calves were a little bit older, and this was in the spring. So straight away, there was a little bit of a difference there in the pattern of what they were seeing. So when I got out there, sure enough, there was a heifer that was down, and she was scouring, and there was a couple of dead paddock mates. So I think at this point there was 4 dead, and she was the 5th one affected. And you can see, both of these calves are from this case, so they're on really good pastures, plenty of feed there, yet they're just ill thrifty, crappy coats. They're not growing well. It's a bit hard to tell from these photos, but they were pretty undergrown for what they were. And I don't know if you can appreciate it, but this animal in the top here. If you have a look at her knee joint, there's a bit of swelling there, standing in sort of an abnormal posture. Yes, there's a few other things going on here that would suggest that this is not your common calf scours type syndrome. Because there was a dead animal available, it was brilliant, very easy to get liver samples in this scenario. We didn't have to do liver biopsies on live animals. So we took bloods from the clinically affected animals as well as a cow, and we sent them off to the lab, as well as a heap of other post-mortem samples just to rule out some other diseases that it could have possibly been. So this came back as a confirmed case of secondary copper deficiency. So the lab informed us that copper levels were low, and we investigated further with plant tissue samples and the soil samples, and that's when we worked out that molybdenum levels were throwing the copper out. The farm had a really good history of copper zinc moly application, so we knew that they were putting enough copper out, but when we looked at the ratio of copper to moly, we knew that's where our issue was coming from. So on the right hand side here, these are blood sample results, because the liver samples were actually, they couldn't detectably trace any copper in the liver at all. So I didn't even bother putting them up. But there's an animal that's not highlighted in yellow, and that's one of the cows. So this is a perfect example of where her blood levels of copper are within normal reference range. So she shouldn't have any signs of copper deficiency, but I would put a very big question mark over what her liver reserves are. So I didn't take a liver biopsy from her, but it would be interesting to know whether or not she had minimal reserves there as well, and was on her way to becoming similar to the calves. Then the two results that are highlighted in yellow, they're from one live calf and one calf that died shortly after, and you can see they're basically negligible. There's nearly nothing there. So I've put the little jugs back in here. Little jugs back in here to sort of just put that analogy again together. So this calf at the top, she's got a little bit left in her cup. So when we take the blood sample, there's a little bit there to measure. But if you measured her liver levels, there would be very minimal to nothing there. And this poor little calf at the bottom here, which actually died, she's got nothing in her blood and nothing in her liver at all. So that's a pretty extreme case of what you would see. And so I guess it's pretty easy to put an economic value on what happened here through the ones that have died. But then also you could make some assumptions as well on the effects of your growth rates and some other problems with lameness, etc., like that. So that's a pretty extreme case, and it's probably not. That's certainly not the most common scenario that we see down here, but it can get to that point. And both of these cases that I'm going to show you are brilliant producers. They're some of the best producers in the region. So this is certainly not a case of neglect at all. So the second case I want to talk to you about probably is what I would deem to be the most have the most significant economic effect. So these calves at the top here, so these are cattle that are on pasture, so they're being finished for coals, and you take a photo of them and you think there's nothing wrong with them. And I got a call from this producer. They'd brought the cattle in to draft up a kill, and when they weighed them, put them over the scales, the cattle had either done nothing in that month, or a few of them had gone backwards. So to look at the cattle, there didn't actually seem to be much wrong with them at all, but the data didn't lie. They just weren't performing. So we took a few samples from them to rule out some basic problems. We ruled out parasites as being trouble, and we had a discussion at the time about having a look at trace elements. And so we decided to run a trace element panel on these guys, and their copper levels came back quite interesting. So there's actually only 5 that I've showed here, but we compared cattle that were losing weight compared to the cattle that were just holding weight, and this was the same sort of result that we got from both groups, but I've only shown 5 here. So 2 out of the 5 that are highlighted here have low low levels on their blood. So we know if the blood levels are low, then their liver levels are depleted as well. And so although these are only 2 out of 5 animals, given they're all run as the same cohort, they've been running together for quite a number of months, it was probably likely that the paddock mates were all heading in the same direction. So this producer went on and did their own trial. So they did it over quite a large number, a couple of hundred head, and they drafted them 2 ways. So one way got copper injection, the other way didn't, got boxed back up together, got put out on the same pasture together, left out there for a month, and then brought back in and weighed again. And their average daily gains were compared. And these were animals, again, that had all been running together for a long time. And I believe that they were actually homebred ones, not bought in. So we took out any bias that might have been there from being from different properties of origin. And anyway, so they came back and they compared the growth rates, and there was an over a kilo a day difference per head in growth rate between the treated and untreated group. So that was quite a significant difference between the two, just off one copper injection. So that was pretty hard evidence here that they had although the cattle looked healthy, they had a really good copper responsive, copper treatment responsive condition going on. And this is where I mean about how this problem can have significant effects on your bottom line, because unless you're weighing really regularly, every month or daily, like Kent does with his OptiWeigh, then you just might not be capturing this data. And looking at the animals visually, there's no way that you would pick up the difference between the two of them, because otherwise just simply aren't sensitive enough. But I mean, you can do that maths pretty quickly and crudely. A kilo of difference a day per head, and if you're feeding a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand at a time, that's a significant difference in your profitability in just one day, let alone over a few months of a grazing period. And this is a scenario which is probably the most common, where people have a problem, but they're not appreciating it. But it can be quite insidious, and the additive effects, I guess, of the effects of poor performance can be significant.
We've got everybody still online, which is absolutely fantastic. Andrew Wallace says, what is the preferred method if the supplement where the copper status is unknown? Injectable, bolus, lick, block, etc.?
Good point, Drew. So I guess putting my vet hat on here, if you don't know what your copper status is, you need to find out, because what you don't want to be doing is throwing supplementation at animals that are not copper responsive, because you've got no return on investment there. So if you're chucking a couple of dollars of copper down the throat or in the neck of an animal that doesn't need it, well, that's obviously a waste of money. And also you've got to remember that certain trace elements like copper and selenium, excuse me, they can be toxic. So if you're giving them at high doses when they don't need to be given, you can actually throw the cattle into the other scenario where you're causing copper toxicity. And that's specifically, we've got to be certainly conscious of that with sheep. They're much more sensitive to copper than what cattle are. So probably in most scenarios, if you chucked a bit of copper into the neck of a cow, most times it'll be all right. But in sheep, you could certainly cause some significant problems there. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend supplementing without actually knowing what your levels are. It's not expensive really to do a screening test. So there's a pretty good return on investment there. And also, if you don't know what sort of copper problems that you've got, you don't know which form to supplement with. So with your secondary deficiency, if you've got high sulfur, moly, zinc, etc. in your feed, then an oral form of supplementation is not going to help you because it's being bound up in the room and the animal can't utilize it. So if you're either using your fertilizer, licks, boluses, etc., they're not going to help. Then the injection is the way to go. Hopefully that answers your question there.
Absolutely. And I can't resist calling out Hayley's very typical coming from Hayley. She says, grow some saltbush. It accumulates copper and selenium. Sorry, she couldn't help herself. For those of you who don't know Hayley, she has a special skill when it comes to saltbush. I just also want to wind back to the question that Tim sent to Kim, when Tim said, what about spreading alkaline clay? Do we think it might have a similar effect as lime? And Kim responds that our copper issues are the worst on farms we've spread the most lime on and have subsequently the best pH. And Hayley comes back and says, Kim, are they the same soils that you grow the brassicas and chicories? You get some high S and poor NS ratios with those species. And interestingly, he says, no, mainly annual ryegrass and clover, sandy loam over clay. Rightio. So look, I think 2 hours on a Zoom is a fantastic result. I'm not going to ask you to stay online too much longer. Jess, there's some lovely comments from your team at Murdoch congratulating you, and what a fantastic job you've done. And I absolutely concur with that. So please join me, everyone, in giving a big thanks to Jess. She's done a fantastic job.